I have seen multiple occasions where a person supposedly was dead, and by definition, brain dead. If you are brain dead, you don't need any permission from anybody to disconnect somebody from a machine or stuff like that. But there are specific criteria as to what constitutes a patient that is brain dead. So a brain dead person, for example, would not have any feeling. When I was doing my fellowship training, every time there was a potential organ harvest, I would fly with a cardiothoracic surgeon to wherever was the deaf person, so that we would examine the lungs, and if the lungs were good, then we could get the lungs out. In order to do that, I would do a procedure called bronchoscopy, where you put in a scope into the lungs, and if you are deaf, you don't cough, you don't move, you don't anything. So there were more than one instance where I would go in, I put in my little scope, and the patient starts either moving or coughing. And you look at the nursing staff and you say, hey, this person is not deaf. What are you talking about? And of course,
and what did they say?
Well, our neurologist said that, that the EEG had a flat line or whatever. It's like, look, there are specific criteria. You have to have total cessation of blood flow to the brain. We now have a variety of different ways by which we can identify brain death, but needs to be corroborated by two clinicians. You cannot just be jumping the gun.
Right.
And that's one of the problems that's happening. You have critically ill patients, and the nurses will come and tell you, shall we start calling the transplant team? The person is not dead, and they're already telling you. And that is embedded into many of the policies, because believe it or not, one of the ways by which you get evaluated by CMS and some of these other federal companies is by whether or not you follow their guidelines. And one of the guidelines is that for every person that dies in the hospital, you have to call the transplant team. Everybody, no matter whether you are a donor or not a donor, everybody you have to call the transplant team. And the problem is that many of these hospitals are doing it ahead of the game. The person is not dead yet. The person has not been declared dead, but you already have somebody that comes in, and I hate to do the analogy, but these people are salivating, and I remember many of the nurses would come and tell us, hey, the vultures are coming in, because they're just salivating to see what organ can we get out of this person. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the IMA Weekly Show. I am Dr. Joseph Varon. I'm the co-founder and chief medical officer and president of the Independent Medical Alliance. It may sound a little morbid what we'll be discussing today, but it's something that I think most of our viewers need to understand and need to know. Trust in public health is already quite fragile in this country, and tonight we're going to be examining two deeply connected stories. Questions about what happens in the US and in China as far as organ procurement, the ethics and this global crisis that we have about forced organ harvesting. For close to 40 years, I have seen patients that require organ transplantations, and organ transplants definitely, are needed. We need to save people's lives. But how we go about them, that's where things get a little confusing. So to help us navigate this particular area, I have today the great opportunity to bring someone that has spent years uncovering uncomfortable truths. And this is Jan Jekielek. He's a senior editor and investigative journalist for the Epoch Times, and he's the host of America's Top Leaders. Jan, welcome to this show. We know how much you've worked on this area, and we're hoping that you're going to help us understand some of these things that probably shouldn't be happening as we speak. Before we start and we go into this investigative side, so that you guys know, today for me this is one of the most important webinars I've done, because for the first time I'm going to go backwards with Jan. Jan tends to interview me. Now today I'm going to be the one doing the interview. I'm going to be doing all the questions. I call this revenge, sweet revenge. So I'm going to be asking as many questions as I can, because there are a lot of ethical gray zones. And before we start with that, let me just show you some slides on how transplantation is supposed to occur. And then I'll leave it to Jan to tell us some of the issues that we have. So let's talk a little bit about organ transplantation per se. There is no question that, as I said, organ transplants are important. But the question is, how do you get an organ? Who do you get the organ from? When is the person dead and when is the person not dead? We know that organ transplantation has evolved dramatically in the last century and a half. But the concept of brain death, which is a primordial concept that you need in order to make a person be a quote-unquote donor or not a donor, that's a concept that has evolved. And it actually evolved as a report from Harvard in 1968. The so-called dead donor rule, it's supposed to ensure that the organs are removed out of a person once this person is brain dead. That means that they're completely out of it. Just like you heard on the initial video of this interview that Jan had done with me recently. I mean, I have seen people that are truly not dead and they're trying to harvest their organs. Why do we want to have this dead donor rule? Because that's going to protect both the donor and also the public trust that we have in medicine. How do we define death? Well, you have two criteria. You have the criteria of cardiopulmonary cessation of functions and neurological death. And unfortunately, the way we determine this varies depending on institutions. I mean, we see this all the time. One institution has one way to define death, another one has another way to define death, and it has some legal ramifications. Indeed, some states have their own decision as to what constitutes somebody to being dead or not dead. One thing I will tell you, and that's across the US, if you are brain dead, you are dead. That means if your brain is dead, your heart may be beating, your lungs may be breathing through artificial machines, but you are dead. And according to that, you don't need any permission from anybody to disconnect or anything like that. So brain dead it's basically being dead. The problem is that we have a lot of inconsistencies. You have people doing their EEGs and they say, well, the EEG is flat. Well, we've seen people with flat EEGs that come back to life. And once you have this cessation of blood flow to the brain, like I call it, then you need to look at ways to harvest the organs. And there is a lot of timing issues, how fast you can get the organ out, and that gets people to be pushed sometimes. Like I mentioned on Jan's interview, they push you. Sometimes I would go into the bedside of a critically ill patient who wasn't dead yet, but then I would get the nursing staff and other people coming and says, hey, have you called already the organ transplant team, because this person doesn't look like he's going to make it? Well, the patient's not even dead and you're already contemplating removing organs. So that's important. And I know that, you need to think about how do we reestablish circulation, but that has a lot of red flags. And those are things that we need to look into. Who is responsible for it? Well, HHS, CMS, you start looking at what they have. They really, look at things in a different way. And like I was mentioning in an interview with Jan, sometimes calling the transplant team for everybody that dies in the hospital is a requirement to be able uh, to be qualified to get to be a recipient of Medicare benefits. I mean, that's kind of like ridiculous. We really need to have a national ethic framework so we can do this. Now, it is, I mean, like this little heart for those of you who like some horror movies. I mean, this is what we're looking for. So we're looking to keep an organ alive, an organ that is going to be viable, that we can preserve. But how we go about it is the part where we have a lot of issues. And that's where, as doctors, as healthcare providers, we have to remember our basic ethical principles. Our basic ethical principles, the principle of beneficence and the principle of non-maleficence. That means do not harm. That's the number one thing that clinicians do. Primum non nocere, first, do not harm. Well, first, you do not harm even in death. Even if the patient is dead, you don't harm a dead body. And physicians must balance, progress and trying to help people with morality. I mean, we cannot be going out there into a harvesting farm of organs. And, Jan is going to be talking about some of these things that are happening in China, which is really, really, I call it an organ harvesting farm. So we need to make sure that clinicians are aware of informed consent, which is the fundamental part of organ transplantation. And families need to be sure that their loved one is truly dead. I mean, that's a tough concept to come across. So this has a lot of moral implications. I mean, we've been looking at this for many, many, many years. And I would say that one of the things that we see is that media celebrates every time there is a transplant miracles, but they avoid talking about the ethical issues, the difficult ethical issues. This is one of the things where Jan has not been quiet, and that's one of the reasons why he's here. But we need to make sure that the public is aware of what really goes on behind the scenes. What do we need? Well, for the near future, we're going to need a true unified death definition, completely transparent oversight. That means not because I have a lot of money and I come from another country, I go into the transplant list at a higher level, or I get the organ much faster than somebody else. We need to look at some of these technological advances and remember that medicine must serve life, not redefine death. We cannot come up with new definitions just because we have a shortage of organs. Just as I said, medicine must serve life and not redefine death. With that, I'm going to tell you that's the basic. I mean, I know this is like mini, and at the end of the show, I'll also share that we have a guide that we are going to be putting that we have online now, so that you guys can pretty much all the good, the bad, and the ugly of organ transplantation. But with this in mind, Jan, why don't you just educate us a little bit about the not so nice part of organ transplant?
Well, Joe, Dr. Varon, it's such an honor to be able to do this with you, and I was very, very pleased to get this invitation because it's an issue that I've basically been covering for about 20 years. And somewhere along the way, I even kind of lost hope a little bit because there was so little interest. The idea that people could be being killed, for organs at some scale is just such a macabre, extreme idea that for a lot of people, they just simply don't want to listen in the first place. But let me kind of give you a picture, and thank you. Actually, this was quite an educational seminar for me, as you just kind of explained some of the nuances at the beginning. I have thought about this stuff, but I was more thinking about it a long, long time ago. And the reason that I'm kind of back into this issue is because these last few years represent the first time I've seen in a very, very long time where we can actually make an impact to stop some of these very extreme human rights violations. But let me explain what we discovered, okay? I mean, if you go back to, I think the first sort of rumblings of this that I really found credible go back to about 2005, where there was an Israeli transplant surgeon, actually former head of the Israeli Transplant Association, who had a patient who had a very serious heart condition. And in Israel, of course, there's not, it's a fairly small population. There aren't a lot of organs. It's socialized healthcare. The system pays for people to go outside and get medical treatment that they can't get in country. And so this guy comes to Jacob Levy is the name of the doctor, and he says, I just arranged to have a heart transplant in 2 weeks in China. And Jacob said that's impossible. How could you schedule a heart transplant, right? And except that the guy basically goes and comes back, and after 2 weeks he's got a new heart, and he's there. And Jacob realizes that something terrible has happened. So just to kind of demystify some of that, if it's not obvious, the only way in a situation in an ethical transplant system, or at least as much more ethical transplant system like we have in the US or Canada, or frankly most of the civilized world, there has to be an accident, and the accident needs to be that basically someone is brain dead but body alive. That's the kind of typical scenario, because you can't actually transplant from dead bodies, entirely dead bodies, right? So there has to be some kind of activity, or the end of the cessation of activity. And this is why it was so interesting for me to see those slides earlier, to think about this a little bit. But the bottom line is, it's rare. It's rare for someone to basically have just the right kind of accident and match you in terms of size and in terms of blood type, tissue type, and things like this. And that's why you have to wait a long time for an organ, right? So for one, this idea that you could get something in 2 weeks just out of the box, is kind of crazy. But the second part is, there's only one way that you could know when that heart transplant is going to happen. Schedule it ahead of time. And that is, you're going to know when someone's going to be dead. And the only way you can know that they're going to be dead is if you make them dead yourself. So anyway, for Jacob Levy, this was an obvious, huge problem. And what he actually did was, subsequent to this, is he lobbied very hard, and Israel became the first country to pass a law. And the law was basically that the socialized healthcare system would not support transplants done in China, because there was something terrible happening there. And actually, it took another 15 years. It's only about 3 years ago that the first laws in the US of that nature, of that type, started being passed in states. There's now 6 states that have passed laws like that. But that's just sort of, that was the first kind of taste. That was one thing, right? There was another allegation where a woman came out who was kind of a whistleblower. Her husband was a surgeon, and her husband had been having these nightmares, and their relationship was falling apart. And she confronted him, and he basically confessed to her that she had removed 2,000 corneas from living people. That was the story, right? It sounded unbelievable, macabre. What could possibly be? Is this even like remotely believable? And by the way, all this was kind of happening concurrently, time-wise, like this whistleblower and this, what was happening in Israel, roughly. Okay, and and that's when a few researchers got involved. There was a well-known human rights lawyer from Canada, from Winnipeg in Canada, called David Matas, and another former Canadian Secretary of State named David Kilgour, known for his unusual kind of, I guess, ethics, let's say. Basically, the two of them got commissioned to look at the available evidence that something like this could be. The first question was just simply, could these allegations be true? What is there some other explanation for what we're seeing, for what these people are purporting to be true? And they came up with a report. I think they found 17 lines of evidence, and all of them pointed in the same direction, that yes, this was real, and there was no credible kind of response from the Chinese regime itself. And this is all around too. All of this is happening in 2006, right? And I actually remember there was in Israel, 10,000 people actually signed a petition to expose this situation at Auschwitz. And I happened to be in Poland at the time, where the Germans built the Auschwitz camp, and I'm a Polish native speaker. So I was looking at this issue, and they asked me to help organize that event. So at this Center for Dialogue and Prayer at Auschwitz, they organized a press conference. It was I think the first sort of major press conference on this issue. And so I still really remember this. But those were the beginnings. Joe, perhaps I don't know if you want to lead me along, or I just opened up here, but I can kind of go in any direction here that you see fit.
That's excellent. I mean, this is, it's a great introduction, and it's a great introduction for some people know what's going on out in China. But the question for you is it also going on here in the US? I mean, there is a recent HHS report that said that, there were some issues. I mean, weren't there some issues in Kentucky, and there are concerns that we are removing organs in people that probably are not really dead. What can you tell us about that?
Well, so it's actually, first of all, it's incredible. I see kind of two sides of a coin. Okay, on the one hand, it's of course shocking that the definition of death is sort of sliding to become a little softer, right, so to speak. It's a situation now in the interview that we did together. You described these situations where there's an eagerness to get the transplants, and the question, and of course, so here this is, let's just kind of play this out for a moment, okay? In a situation where there's an accident, right? You have people who want to save this person's life, of course, right? And that's what they have on their minds. And then there's people who, if the person isn't going to live, are hoping to save someone else's life, right, with those organs. And these people kind of come together and have to use these criteria, which, Joe, you described earlier, to ultimately make that decision. Actually, each transplant situation is a complex ethical decision. It's not just a simple thing. Go for it, right? And so there's a really incredible book that was written by a guy named Wesley Smith, actually years ago, and he kind of updated it back in 2016. It's called Culture of Death. And what he writes about in there is the rise of what we call utilitarian bioethics, okay? And so utilitarian bioethics is kind of the opposite of what you would think of Hippocratic medicine, right? Hippocratic medicine is you're the doctor, you have your patient, and your number one priority is to do no harm to that patient, to help that patient as best as you can, whatever you do, right? And that's the way of thinking, right? Utilitarian bioethics is thinking for the greater good, right? It's like, what will actually be better for the greater amount of the population? The problem in this kind of thinking, of course, is that the edges, it becomes very easy to sacrifice the edges, so to speak, right? The unusual cases. Whereas in Hippocratic medicine, it doesn't matter how unusual you are, you're still getting the top standard of care, every single person. And so with this, and I actually think utilitarian bioethics, and Wesley Smith goes into this as well, is actually tied to very materialistic, I'll even use the term, right, kind of communist view of the world, which, there's a famous saying by another guy named Joe Stalin, which is, if you want to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs, right? And so this, again, it's this kind of thinking that for the greater good, in the case of course, in communism, for the success of the party, for the success of the utopian project, it's okay to make sacrifices, right? And when you bring this way of thinking into medicine, you get a situation like this, right? Where these rules get softened. So now going back to China, right? That is an extreme situation, right? There you have a situation where, and let me actually kind of frame this out for you a little bit. How can you have a system that works the way that Joe described as a kind of a farm of organs, right? Well, you have to have groups of people that are considered to be sub-people, right? You have to have very vulnerable groups of people that are considered to be less than human in some way. So what happened is in 1999, the Communist parties in communist countries, there's always an enemy. There's the external enemy, which is always the United States. That's the number one. And there's always internal enemies, because you have to blame somebody for the parties of everything the party did wrong. The Communist Party is infallible in these states. Okay, so you always have someone. So in communist China, it was the landowners at first. Then it was students in 1989, it was the Tiananmen Square massacre. And in 1999, there was a new group, which was called Falun Gong. It was a spiritual movement that, grew very rapidly, very grassroots, very self-directed, 70 to 100 million people, more than Communist Party members. The regime basically decides to crack down on it. And in the process, it turns out these people are very difficult to re-educate, to brainwash, which is their purpose. And they put millions of them in the prisons and labor camps. Okay. And now, somewhere along the way, okay, the Chinese had been working on, figuring out how to do transplants properly, but this was all at a very low scale. But the moment these millions of Falun Gong go into the system, basically the whole transplant industry in China skyrockets, okay, because experiences exponential growth until at least 2005, 06, okay? And so now, and how can that happen? Well, the researchers actually were talking to some people that had escaped from these camps, and they discovered these are just basic human rights researchers. They noticed that a lot of them are getting very expensive medical tests. The Falun Gong practitioners didn't know that was the case. They're saying, look, they're torturing us here. On the other hand, they're taking our blood. They're doing all these what amount to expensive tests, right? People made phone calls and asked about, whether they can get organs, how quickly they can get them. There were doctors on the other line, and these calls were validated in different ways that were saying, I can get you organs in weeks or even days. Yes, I can even get you Falun Gong organs. The Falun Gong were known to be particularly healthy. I mean, this whole body of evidence, okay, basically started to grow. And of course, there were actually ads in newspapers that said in 2 weeks, you can get a new heart, new liver, new kidney, whatever it was. And then there were these crazy anecdotes, right? Like one example was a Taiwanese man who had a rare antibody condition who actually went to China to get a kidney and got fitted with 4 separate kidneys because none of them took. Okay, and then the 4th one, it still didn't work. So he went back, got some more transfusions, and came back a 2nd time. And in the end, the 8th kidney was the one that worked. So you can imagine the kind of stuff that's happening here, right? And the reason this can happen is because some very evil person in the system realized that, hey, we can actually there's a term for this, okay? That Matthew Robertson, who's one of the premier researchers on this, he calls it extractive repression. Okay, if you're going to persecute a group of people, why not monetize it, right? And this was the way they figured out to do it. And as soon as one area or one set of hospitals or one region figured out that you can actually make money doing this and basically have this availability of organs, suddenly everybody had to get in on the game, right? Because it fit within the goals of the party. The goals of the party were grow your transplant system and also get rid of these people, right? And by whatever way, initially it was supposed to be brainwashing, but it turns out these people didn't brainwash well. So, basically deaths in those camps were considered suicides. There was this unwritten rule. Anyway, so what I'm trying to explain is it's a very unique situation, okay, to get this kind of large scale killing for organs, where you basically have a stable or a farm of people who are ready to be killed for organs, right? But the problem is that we here in America and Canada, all sorts of other countries have deep collaborations, okay, with this system. And as I've been learning, I've been researching for my book, Kill to Order. If you want, you can throw up the slide for that. One of the things I discovered, for example, is a lot of the materials, okay, that are actually used for transplantation. We always think of China as manufacturing everything for us. Well, it turns out a lot of the materials for transplantation are actually manufactured in the West and are used in China. I was just reading a report about that. It's astonishing. That's one way of collaboration. There's deep collaboration. There's training of surgeons. And remember, in communist China, there's even, they only started a registry for donation back in 2015, right? Before that, they said they actually took organs from prisoners, although they said these were death row prisoners, even though, the number of transplants was way more than the number of death row prisoners, anything close to what it could have been. And even that, once they said they started a registry, that registry was shown to be a perfect quadratic equation. So in other words, it was fake data. So we have no reason to believe there's actually any real significant legitimate donation. When I say legitimate donation, meaning that situations where the dead donor rule isn't being violated. It's systemic over there. So my contention is, right now, going back to us here, right? We had this idea that we were going to change China. There was the narrative was we're going to pump all this money into China. It's going to become a democracy, and so on and so forth, right? But actually, the reality is it kind of went in the other direction. We sort of adopted some of these repressive and ethically questionable, and in this case, I think it's the softening of our own system basically comes from the fact that we've had these deep collaborations with transplant centers and surgeons where this is basically the norm. So we recently, and to go back to your question, it's a very roundabout way to get back to your question, Joe, but there were 2 transplant systems in America that now HHS has decertified, doesn't let them do this anymore because there were examples where the dead donor rule was actually being violated in the way that it almost was in those cases where Joe was, putting the scope down into the lungs and realizing the person is coughing or whatever. And it's obviously is a massive problem. And if you jump to that slide that you just flipped to, yes. So there's a paper in the American Journal of Transplantation from 2022. In this paper, they looked at several thousand studies in the Chinese transplant literature. And by the way, a lot of these, again, centers that have collaborations with American institutions, and they found at least 71 examples where the dead donor rule was violated. What that means is the dead donor rule, I think you saw it in the definitions there, that you can't kill someone by the extraction of the organs itself, but that's what was happening. And it's so normalized. Again, if you doubt what I'm saying, there's at least 70 instances that they've actually written into the transplant literature itself, okay, that without realizing it, where the method the person dies is by their organs being pulled from their bodies. So here we are. And if you just pulled up another slide, and I just brought this because there's a very large body of evidence that was pulled together in 2019 and 2020 by a group called the China Tribunal. And the China Tribunal basically tried to look at all existing known evidence and took testimony from experts and journalists, even one New York Times reporter who actually got this reported a little bit in the New York Times before she left or was forced to leave. It's unclear. Established beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is actually real. So this, because often the only response the Chinese regime actually has to this is that these are lies. These are anti-China people that are spreading lies to make China look bad. But I wish that were the case, but unfortunately it isn't. And the body of evidence is very wide now as to this happening. There's one more slide, which is a picture of this. I never ever thought we would actually find a survivor of this, but Peiming Cheng, he escaped to Thailand from China. He has this big gash you can see in his side, 14-inch scar, where surgeons went in and took part of his liver and part of his lung. And again, I could talk a lot more about this. The main issue with him is that he exists. He survived. The scans show that this happened, and the Chinese regime admits they did it against his will. So we have at least one instance, and this organ harvesting survivor coming out was a milestone because there was suddenly a lot more media coverage on this issue than there ever had been before.
Clearly, I mean, clearly, this goes. What happens in China goes beyond ethics. It's actually this is human rights. This is basic human rights, and I know that most of you who are who are watching are probably thinking that this is some kind of a weird episode of some terror show, but this is the reality. And when we talked the other day, I told you, well, yes, I know China is bad. They are doing bad things, no question about that, based on this. But we're not that far here in the US. I mean, you see that people are booted from the transplant list because some rich donor comes in and donates a wing to the hospital, and then the person out of the blue gets a transplant. We get pushed to have all these situations. So, I mean, this is a serious problem. I know that, Jan, you've been looking at it, obviously, of that farm that we talked about, where they have killing people to get organs, but we may be getting into that situation if we are not smart in this country.
Well, one area which is a very fraught area, an area where, this is, I don't even know how to unpack the ethics around this. But in Canada, you might be familiar, there's something they call medically assisted suicide, which is euthanasia. And Canada is one of the 2 countries in the world where this doctor-assisted suicide is actually considered a medical procedure, right? And so there's actually like a billing code for it, so to speak, right? Wow. And when that happens, right, basically it grows very quickly. So in Canada, right now, medically assisted suicide, from what I understand, is the number 5 cause of death in terms of, and it's I forget how many years it's been now that it's been happening. But there is one actual example of someone who, basically committed suicide with help, right, in the Canadian model, and then their heart was quickly restarted afterwards and transplanted. So now you can see the potential ethical issues here, right? Because you can imagine people who are feeling hopeless, people who are, there are rules about who can actually apply for this in Canada, but they're every year they're kind of weakening, or there's attempts to basically let more and more people basically do this with relative ease. And you can imagine situations where people are, like I said, they don't feel like they're important in society. Maybe if they give their organs, maybe if they give up their life and their organs can go to someone who wants to live more or something, like, wouldn't that be a good thing? I'm trying to kind of paint you a picture of the kinds of discussions that people will be having, the kinds of things people will be thinking to themselves when it becomes sort of a norm, right? A norm for people to do this, and it is becoming that way. One of the things we discovered during COVID, and a lot of people watching here, I'm sure, are very familiar with the realities of COVID, that human beings are mimetic, right? We're very susceptible to fads and sort of mind viruses and so forth. And so this area, to me, it's incredibly fraught, because you can sort of imagine where this could go, where the incentive structures kind of create a situation where people are kind of encouraged to be good people and support the country, and then sort of, they were, on the one hand, they're reducing healthcare costs, right, in a healthcare system that's severely in big trouble in Canada, and as it is in the US as well, frankly, and at the same time helping save lives. Right, that's how it could be sold very easily, right? And you can imagine media in unison explaining how great this is, how righteous it is, and so forth, and could create a human rights catastrophe if we're talking about that. So we have to be very careful and really eyes open when it comes to this stuff.
Well, to this stuff, and again, that's everywhere, not just in China. I know that we for years, and you and me, we talked about it. It was the classic story that if you go down to South America and then you meet this good-looking señorita, you may end up having no kidney, wake up without a kidney. And it's true. I mean, or the instance where I told you that at some point in time, years ago, I had this patient of mine, and this Italian gentleman who needed a kidney transplant, but he had bad lungs. And I told him, you cannot get the lungs. And he basically told me, what size kidneys do I need? I'll get them. I mean, people are still doing this. This is a serious problem, and we need to find a way by which we can somehow regulate some of these things. I mean, I still think that they're going to have a lot of these phantom places where illegal transplantations are occurring. My concern is that the ones that are being done legally, look at what happened in Houston. In Houston, we just recently had a hospital that was completely taken off the transplantation system because there was some dealings going on between the surgeon and who get a transplant, who didn't get a transplant. You have so many ethical issues. I'm sure you are familiar with the most recent action of the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, who just went after Methodist Hospital and says, what do you mean you are not allowing people that did not get vaccinated to be part of a transplant thing? You have 2 weeks to tell me why did you do that? I mean, we have to come up with some way. And again, I think you have more expertise, believe it or not, than all of us, because you have seen it at a global level as to what we can do as a healthcare providers to protect the sanctity of organ transplantation and organ harvesting. I mean, these farms of harvesting organs they should not exist. And
well, Joe, if I can jump in, right? I think this is so what we're seeing, right? And this is the cost of inaction, right? So we've known that this exists for 20 years. I mean, I'm talking about this extreme situation, right? Even when you talk about these, organ rings, which exist in a whole bunch of countries, right? These illicit organ rings. This is not, millions of people at the state and the state organizing it, right? And here's the issue, right? Number one, it was ignored with the Falun Gong for, decade and a half. Then the Chinese regime turned on a new group, the Uyghur Muslims, okay? And now they put millions of those people in camps up in Xinjiang. And we believe the same thing is happening there, because why wouldn't it? And there's a market, believe it or not, for what's called halal organs, right? Muslims prefer to get transplants from Muslims, right? So anyway, because the cost of inaction is twofold. Okay, one is that it moves. When you're dealing with these extreme crimes against humanity, there's a reason why there's a genocide convention, right? It's because these things spread when you just completely, when you say, oh, I don't want to know about it, I want to ignore it, I'm going to pretend none of this is real. It spreads to another group, or in effect, right? Imagine, right? We're looking at 20 years of the US transplant system working, very closely with a place where this is the norm, right? So what I mean is, if right now we have 3 pieces of legislation, 2 have actually passed federally, the House. One is called the Falun Gong Protection Act, another one the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. These are things that at the very least say this is horrible what's happening, and actually we denounce it, and we're going to sanction people that are involved in this, right? This would be a kind of a first step to say, look, horrible things done with organs are not allowed. We condemn these things, and that will actually have a trickle down effect. Everyone involved in transplantation will be aware that something like this exists. At the moment, right, up to now, it's kind of been a free for all. Even and just the fact that it's become so prevalent in the U.S., right, to violate this dead donor rule, right, that HHS has to come in from the top and say, my God, what's happening here, right? Yeah, basically, there have to be consequences for this sort of egregious behavior if we don't draw a very clear line, right, and explain to people this is allowed, this is morally reprehensible, this is wrong, and we're gonna punish people at least in some basic way, right? And for Chinese officials, they have their exit strategies to America. That's the place they most want to go, right? That's where they have their money. So that it's actually real teeth. There'll be less people involved in doing this.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating and it's scary. It's really scary. I mean, a lot of my friends say, hey, I'm an organ donor, but I am concerned. I mean, that may kind of expedite my early demise if I go to the hospital with something, because they may push me, because we are copying some of those actions that China has. Are you concerned, or any of your sources concerned, of what this means for you? I mean, I guess you cannot go to China, if not, they are going to shoot you or something like that, because it's a true concern. I mean, you are bringing up a true genocide.
It's, there's one of the provisions in the Falun Gong Protection Act is to assess whether this construes an atrocity under the Elie Wiesel Act. And so, but whatever it is, let's just say it's some of the worst things that human beings can do to each other. I think we don't, I try not to get stuck in the discussion. Actually, this China tribunal, I'll just mention this. One of the questions they ask, oh, is it genocide? Because see, genocide is a very specific definition. That's why I hate when I hear people throwing genocide around casually, in different contexts. It's a very specific thing. It means you're trying to destroy to the last person an entire group of people, or even a part of a group of people. If that is your purpose, right, that will be construed genocide. There's a few sort of elements to that. Now, if there's a profit motive. So this is the argument that the people at the China tribunal were having with each other. Well, maybe it's not genocide because there's another motive. It's not actually, it's not really to destroy the group of people. It's just to make money. Then it's not genocide. So you could have this debate, right? Or it's extractive repression. It's both happening at the same time. But really, it's just an evil yet to be seen on this planet, which is what David Matas called it. And so it's like we absolutely have to take stands against these extreme things, because otherwise they basically just spread and it becomes somehow normalized in people's minds that you can do terrible things like this.
And that's a concern that I have, especially now that you said normalized, because I mean, you and me, we talked about the meeting between Ping and Putin, and when they had that hot mic, I mean, and basically they said, hey, you can live God knows how many years by just repeated transplants. So it's like, hey, we're going to be doing this, and how can we, start working on this? It's scary. It is.
One of the conspiracy, I'll call it conspiracy theory, because so generally when I speak with Americans, right? Well, you speak with Americans or Canadians, they'll think, oh yeah, look, there was a hot mic moment. They were exposed talking about this continual organ transplantation to achieve longevity. By the way, they have a special project to give the Chinese elites a longevity of 150 years. Okay. And that's what they were actually referring. That's what Xi Jinping referred to when he said 150 years. So this is it's a very, very extreme kind of situation where you're imagine that you are for a Chinese person. How do I say this? For the, I don't know if it's the typical Chinese, but a number that I've talked to, they don't believe for a second that this hot mic was by accident. They think the regime is in way too powerful of a control to allow for it. So one of their ideas is that this is a kind of signaling either to the world, hey, listen, we're open for business. If you have the cash, you can do this. Of course, and if you have ethical, you don't mind ethically what we're talking about here, you can become part of our club, right? That's one way. Another way that I've heard is that this is Xi Jinping signaling that he's going to be around for 150 years. So if he's having a lot of troubles in China right now. I don't know how much your audience will know about this, but basically it looks like he's lost control of the military. This could be him signaling, hey, I'm actually going to be around for 150 years. So watch out, watch your back. Don't try to pull anything on me here.
And,
so anyway,
and our reviewers may say, hey, we're focusing too much on China. What about the US? I mean, they need to understand that the US follows what China is doing. And that's the biggest concern. The biggest concern is that we are going to eventually start thinking, hey, maybe we should just start looking at ways to harvest early. Maybe we'll come up with something like Canada of the, assisted suicide to start getting more organs faster. I mean, that's a serious concern.
A case in point for this, okay? A massive case in point will be very familiar to your audiences here and us, right? Mm-hmm. We had protocols on what to do in a pandemic. We ignored all of them and we used protocols like what the Chinese Communist Party did. How crazy is that, right? Talk about following China and creating disaster.
And especially the U.S. following China. I mean, that's what, the complete opposite that what we should. I mean, this is extremely concerning. But the question is, what can we everyday people or healthcare professionals on the West do to either combat this or raise awareness of what's going on? I mean, truly, I mean, this is like a macabre episode of our webinar. But most of us were not aware of this. I mean, the awareness that you have brought on tonight, it gives me goosebumps. I mean, just to think that they have farms out there where you go in and you basically get butchered into several pieces to give organs to others.
If you could pull up the slide with the ISHLT, this is actually, there's a transplant association here in America that has taken a strong stand. And if we can pull up that slide, then you can see what they said. But that's an example of something that can be done, and it's very meaningful. I'm trying to see if I can, oh yeah, I can read it. Okay, so this is what the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation said, okay? Given the body of evidence that the government of the People's Republic of China stands alone in continuing to systematically support the procurement of organs or tissue from executed prisoners, submissions related to the transplantation and involvement of either organs or tissue from the human donors in the People's Republic of China will not be accepted, okay? So this seems like, okay, so they made a statement. No, this is very powerful. Okay, I would, if you're members of professional associations, right, this is exactly the sort of thing that is incredibly helpful, because it's basically international, very reputable organizations taking a stand and saying, yes, I accept that this is real and that we have to stop it. Why? Like you said, Joe, very well, because it migrates here. Mm-hmm. If we don't take a stand and we don't stop it, it migrates here. And again, there's this legislation that's out there that is absolutely the right way to go. There's even a third, I mentioned there's a third piece of legislation which is still in committee in the House federally, that works kind of like that Israeli law, where it says, that Medicare and insurance can't support pay for these kinds of transplants. So there's different ways to tackle it, but the critical part is to shine a light on it and in as powerfully as possible, especially in law, say that this is wrong, this is evil, this should never be done, and people involved will be punished in some way or their lives will be made more difficult. Every one of the little steps like this that are made makes a huge difference, in my opinion.
Well, after all you've seen, I mean, what gives you hope that truth and, bringing the truth like you just did today can still prevail and that the integrity of medicine can be restored? I mean, how are we going to do this? If we're following what they're doing up in China, if we're, doing things for profit, how am I going to trust medicine? I mean, how are we going to do it? I'm get concerned. I mean, not only do I want to continue to be an organ donor? I mean, what gives me hope?
Well, what gives me hope, okay, and if I may, right, is organizations like yours, like the group we're speaking here today, okay, Independent Medical Association, and related groups, right? So I think right now, medicine, how we think about medicine is being transformed, right? Like, I think, I'm not even sure if Dr. JD Yang is a fellow with you yet or not. I know you've been talking with him, but we're talking about moving from disease care model to a true healthcare model. So for me, this is massively hopeful. I mean, go back, 5-10 years, I didn't even realize that we're in a disease care model, right? I didn't fully grasp it. I mean, I've mostly been outside of it for a whole bunch of reasons, right? That's a different story. But there's actually a foundational transformation happening. And part of that is going back to Hippocratic medicine as well, which is that, it's the doctor-patient relationship. It's thinking about how can I do the best possible thing for this individual patient? None of this, sort of statistical by the numbers, blanket rulings about what kind of medicine can be used, what kind of can't. No, one by one. And it means, reschooling our doctors, and JD Yang has this vision, right, of creating a medical school, powerful medical school of doctors that are doing this, and not just him. There's other examples of this. This is just the one that I'm most familiar with right now. But there's kind of a renaissance. There's a shift happening, and I feel it. And then there's people, like yourself and many of the other doctors that are part of the IMA, which are kind of become pillars of medical ethics, and I hope that they also are take a stand on this issue, because again, it's one of these things. It's sort of a no-brainer, right?
This is great, Jan. Let's bring in Autumn so that she can uh, ask us a few questions that I'm sure we have from our audience. I mean, I'm sure that we could keep on talking for this for the next 4 hours nonstop because it's such an important thing. So, Miss Autumn, talk to us.
Hi, thank you both for being here. The first question that I wanted to bring up is from David. He asked, who is teaching morality in medical schools? What do they base their teachings upon? If either of you can speak to that.
Well, I can tell you that they're not. That's one thing that I can tell you for fact, or at least the medical students that I get, they haven't learned it. But the fact is that, all the things that we used to teach in medical school, history of medicine, simple, history of medicine, ethics, I mean, all of that is being put apart. Why? Because we are being taught more on, like what we were saying earlier, disease states, how to treat the hypertension, then give a pill instead of, these are the things that you need to do for yourself. So I agree with you, Jan. I mean, we need a new model, and it's a model that many of us are trying to adopt, and many of us just open our eyes as a result of the pandemic. I guess the pandemic had something good about it. It opened the eyes of many of us. But morality is, you basically learn the morality from your attendings, from your teachers, from the people that you are in. So if you have an attending that decides that he's going to be transplanting somebody because he comes from Saudi Arabia and just donated a new wing to the hospital instead of the other poor person that was on top of the list, then you know that that's not the morality that you need to learn.
If I may, in the IMA journal right now, I think it's the previous issue, there is this paper on the ACES model of medicine. And I think JD was telling me that it was very quickly accepted, very appreciated by the reviewers. And again, so this is one model, which I happen to like a lot, that is you can imagine medical schools being based on this, and the ethics are a core central pillar of this model.
Yeah.
Laura Chamberlain asked, Jan, how did Pei-Ming escape from China?
It's an unbelievable story. So, you may know that I made a Holocaust documentary about my father-in-law, and I've spoken with a number of Holocaust survivors. So all of them have these stories, which are basically, there were all these moments in their lives where, if they had made one decision, they just happened to make a decision. Like, for example, my father-in-law, Manny, he switched the number with someone because he wanted to be, with his father. And the one train went to certain death because he switched it, so he lived many times. There were these moments where he lived, basically, where it could have very easily been the end. To summarize with Cheng Pei-Ming, this was the situation. I mean, he woke up, he didn't even understand what had happened to him. He woke up chained, and he had a big cut in himself, but he didn't even know until much later that he had organs harvested. You see, it's kind of a weird thing. Like, you wouldn't guess, right? You wouldn't think of it. And there were just to get out of China. Once he was out of China, he stayed in hiding for a very long time. And it took actually years to be, ultimately he decided to go public with this, right? But yeah, that's the short of it is almost a miracle. Yeah.
Karen asked, how does MAID, medical assistance in dying, factor into transplants? Well,
to be honest with you, it shouldn't. It shouldn't. But my concern is that it's going to. And I'm telling you, if Canada is an example of that, we are going to be having a lot more donors, quote unquote.
And I understand that this donor actually, I understand that this donation actually went to a U.S. hospital. So, I don't know that. I think you really need some very clear ethical guidelines set up around this, because this could be, just a moral and ethical disaster in the brewing right now.
I'll move on to our last question before we move into our closing announcement, since we're already at the top of the hour. Bob Isaacson asked, what is the latest research on growing organs in vitro for transplant?
there is actually a lot of really interesting data. And I'm sure that all of you have heard about the pig organs that have been done, some of stem cells that are being grown into things. Israel actually has a couple of really interesting studies going on because, as you know, organ donation in Israel is very, very limited. As within Judaism, you are not allowed to donate an organ in general. So there are a lot of really interesting things. Now, having said that, we're far away from being able to start transplanting people with either animal organs or stem cell derived organs. I mean, I'm really thinking at least another 20 years.
Jan, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience with before Dr. Varon and I move to our closing announcements?
Well, I'm actually, if anyone out here happens to be in Idaho, I'm actually coming to Boise on the 25th in the evening. I'm there with the Idaho Freedom Caucus. And I would love to see it. And we're going to be talking about the bigger picture. I think, again, the topic of the book that I've done is half of it is about this industry and how it all works, but the other half is it's actually a lens onto how things work over there in the system. And so we're going to be talking about this and the impact. We talked about the impact on America today. We're going to be talking about sort of a broader picture of that. So if you happen to be in Idaho, I would love to see you there. It's in Boise on the 25th on Saturday on the evening.
That's wonderful. And we'll be sure to make sure that our team drops the link for that in the chat for anybody that's interested in joining.
Yeah.
Dr. Varon, I know you have a slide that you'd like to speak to. So
Yes.
Jan, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Jan, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to interview you. I mean, it makes me I feel that now we are the same. Now I feel very good. No, but thank you, Jan. You open the eyes of a lot of people. I mean, I'm getting text messages right and left of, I mean, this is an horror show. It's like, no, this is the reality. And just like you said, just opening the eyes of people, it's important. Now, with that, Ms. Autumn, you have that extra slide for me?
Yes, I do. Livio, if you could bring it up on screen.
So, after doing a little work on this, we decided to come up with a new tool and guide for everybody. You can find it in our website, and it's basically understanding organ donation, transplants, and brain death. And I think that everybody, absolutely everybody that is watching us, should download this guide. You will understand what an organ donation is, how the organ procurement is done, what is brain death, what are the definitions of brain death. I'm not saying, and let me be very clear, I'm a big proponent of organ transplantation because I do see that they make a big difference. But I am against some of the things that were mentioned today. So download this guide. You guys will like it and use it for future decisions as to whether or not you want to donate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Varon. I'll continue our closing announcements. Okay, so last week, the Independent Medical Alliance brought together leading physicians and policymakers in Washington, D.C. for strategic meetings with Senators Ron Johnson, Rand Paul, and many others. To learn more about IMA's work in D.C. And to read the full article on our website, you can visit the short link on screen, and you can also scan the QR code on screen as well. Mold and mycotoxins, they don't just cause allergies. They can quietly weaken your immune system, disrupt your hormones, and create conditions where cancer can take hold. If you've never considered mold to be a cancer risk, you're not alone. Learn more about the latest research that functional medicine experts are revealing. You can find the full article on our website or the short link or QR code on screen. Next week, October 22nd at 7 p.m. Eastern, we hope that you won't miss our show, Farming for the Future, Reclaiming the Integrity of Our Food, with IMA Senior Fellows Dr. Ryan Cole as host, Dr. Brooke Miller, and special guest Joel Salatin from Polyfaced Farms. Join us as they dig into how honest farming and clean food are key to restoring true health. If you'd like to watch the full Epoch TV interview that we featured at the start of tonight's show, where Jan turns the tables and actually interviews Dr. Varon, you can follow the short link on screen or scan that QR code as well to watch the full conversation. If you donate $1,000 by this Friday, you'll be able to join Dr. Paul Merrick's private cancer research discussion. Your gift will directly support our work to continue to advance alternative cancer therapies. You can give today at imahealth.org/donate. All right, well, before we close tonight, I'd like to share a short clip from IMA President and Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Joseph Varon, who will speak powerfully about the global crisis of trust in our healthcare systems, shaped by years of top-down mandates, politicized science, and eroded transparency. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and let's take a look.
I'm Dr. Joseph Varon. I'm the President and Chief Medical Officer of the Independent Medical Alliance. I am today in Calgary at the We Unify Congress, a meeting that is meant to unify not just healthcare profession, but many other areas into a freedom movement. First of all, the first thing that I have learned is that there is no perfect healthcare system anywhere in the world of the places that I have seen. The one thing that I have seen, however, is that the healthcare in the United States has gone down very rapidly. And when you compare us to other countries, it's scary. For example, to know that the United States now is number 38 in the world as far as healthcare. And just on top of us is Cuba, number 37. It makes us feel like, come on, what are we doing wrong? When I travel the world, I actually see that patient care changes a lot when there are excessive amount of profits in between. Clinicians start forgetting about the patients. They just care about the money. And that is the problem. You start seeing all these, very wealthy hospital systems just bringing in more and more doctors, and they become a system which is really a revolving door. Get them in, get them out, get them in, get them out. It's just drain or prune the insurance of a person. Really, we are part of this big movement. And honest medicine, in of by itself, the name says it all. It's all about honesty, all about transparency, all about empowering patients to be their own decision makers, to help people understand that each choice, each decision, each therapeutic intervention that they get has consequences. And as long as you know what those consequences are, you're okay, because you get to make that choice. The honest medicine healthcare provider will put the patient first before any kind of profit. Part of me tells me, great, there are other people like us who are trying to bring a little bit of common sense to humanity as to what's going on out there. But then I also see and hear some of the stories from all these people that are very similar to our stories. They have the same number of threats against their license, against their lives, against their livelihoods. That really makes me sad. However, I am a positive guy, and I'm a big believer that there is always a light at the end of the tunnel. And if you don't work for it, you won't get it. And as long as I'm alive, I'll keep on fighting for this.